Hi, Robert. Hi, Clive. Nice to meet you.
Meet you?
Nice to meet you, Anthony.
It's a privilege to have you both as a guest on the show. And before we start with the hard questions, could you give a brief introduction about yourself?
Start with Robert. Let's start with Robert. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I'm actually a chartered accountant by profession, long retired, with experience in the corporate sector. And I got into climate change recreationally around the turn of the millennium. It fascinated me as a subject. I went on to complete a PhD in the subject in 2013 at the tender age of 67. And I have just continued with it ever since. And my thesis was to do with complexity theory and geoengineering. And when I started this in 2009, geoengineering, one of the lines about geoengineering at the time was that you could read everything that was ever written about geoengineering in the course of one transatlantic flight. That is certainly no longer true. There is a vast literature on the subject now, although in the real world, there is very little geoengineering of any type actually happening. But it's always been a crazy idea. And the more we fail with what you might call conventional responses to climate change, the more the crazy idea of geoengineering becomes real. And we're on the threshold of that now. I don't like the idea of geoengineering, but I don't like the idea of not geoengineering. And we'll get into that, no doubt, in more detail in the next statement.
Great. And Clive?
Yeah. I teach IT to adults, companies for a living. But I realized I sort of semi-retired and had some time and started getting interested in climate change. And I realized, hey, this is rather, in 2008, rather important question that nobody seems to know the answer. Is it real and man-made? Is it real, and if so, is it man-made? So I started buying books. It wasn't until I bought Jim Hanson's Storms of My Grandchildren that I began to understand. It was taking me right back to school days, science, thinking about physics again. I was good at that at school, at least anyway. I did engineering at university. So, and I co-founded Citizens Climate Lobby UK, which was carbon, lobbying for carbon pricing. And it was all very organised as a global, movement, but not really getting anywhere. And so then I discovered this gentleman, Franz Oeste, who's a German chemist, and his ideas seemed to me the most interesting that I'd seen so far. For example, just noticing that mineral dust blowing over the ocean, there's certain chemistry that removes methane from the air, and they measured that only last year. He came out with that 25 years ago, almost to the day. Only last year they measured it. He's not a loud scientist. He just works very hard, and what he says seems to be right most of the time. I've worked quite closely with him now since 2019, so I've learned a great deal about chemistry from him. So that's my background really, and I know Robert through the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. It's an email group of about 200 of us, and we're really rather concerned about climate change.
We all should be.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll start off with a warm-up question. So what does climate change mean to you? And how do you view sustainability?
Do you want to say, Robert?
Well, climate change is simply the physical reality of what's happening around us. The climate is changing, and it manifests itself in a whole range of different ways, depending upon where you are on the planet. But and it's very closely linked to sustainability. Sustainability is an idea that's been around quite a while, some decades. People have talked. The word sustainability has been in in the literature. And there are obviously many ways of defining it. And the common themes include supporting the human life on Earth, long-term maintenance of the stock of biological resources and the productivity of agricultural systems, stable human populations, limited growth economies, an emphasis on small scale and self-reliance, continued quality in the environment and ecosystems. All of these things are different ideas about sustainability. But all of these concepts have underneath them one big question. And that is, they all assume that there is something that needs to be sustained. And that begs a vital value question. What is it that we consider to be sufficiently important that it's worth sustaining? I think that's a question that we often don't ask, and we should ask. And in the context of climate change, I think that gives us some very interesting answers, because the question is really culturally specific, and it will vary through time. Different people, different places have different views about what's important. And we have also to recognise that nothing is permanent, although some things may last longer than others. So for me, sustainability is not about sustaining anything in particular, because everything's going to change. It's not about the change. It's about the fact that the change has to happen gradually, so that systems can adapt without their existence being threatened by abrupt and potentially catastrophic change. And that's how I frame our response to climate change. It isn't that we have to restore anything to some idealised past. I mean, after all, we've never had 8 billion people before. Do we really want to go back to a pre-industrial past when there were only 1 billion? I suspect that few people would like that idea. So climate policy for me has one simple objective. I just want to avoid a climate-induced catastrophe that's going to bring about what I call Cocawki, C-O-C-A-W-K-I, Cocawki. It means the collapse of civilization as we know it. And right now, sadly, I think that's where we're headed. But no doubt we'll get into that more later on. So looking at it from the perspective of sustainability, the one thing that I want to sustain is our ability to change and adapt gradually and not be the victims of sudden catastrophic change. And I cut through this by avoiding talk of sustainability or restoration. Whatever one's views may be, we've precious little control over how things are going to develop over the coming decades and centuries. And I stress the word control here. This is not the same as influence. Much of what we do clearly has lasting consequences, but those consequences become increasingly less in our control as time passes. There are just too many ways in which our deeds are redirected, subverted, rendered obsolete by the march of time. And the critical truth is that our actions can never deprive those in the future of their agency, and we're not in control of how they deploy that agency. So our actions will impact their range of choices, but we have to assume that future generations will do what all those through time have always done, which is to endeavour to make the best of their inheritance. So let's consider just for a moment the opposite of sustainable, unsustainable. If something's unsustainable, it must at some point cease to exist. Similarly, if ecosystems on any scale are unsustainable, those systems must at some point collapse. The timing and the manner of the collapse might be uncertain, but the fact that it's going to collapse isn't. So my definition of sustainability is to avoid ecosystem collapses. It's not to avoid change. And translating that definition of sustainability to the challenges of climate change, the name of the game is to minimise and, if at all possible, avoid ecosystem and societal collapses at all scale. And I just close with a little sort of visualization. I visualize this challenge in terms of driving a car at speed through dense fog towards a cliff. Now, the simple question is, will we slow down in time to avoid going over the edge? And this depends on two things. How quickly we slow down and how near the cliff edge is. Now, the fog clearing would help us know how near the cliff edge is, but knowing that isn't sufficient. We still have to slow down or stop or change direction. And in fact, we don't need to know how close the cliff edge is to slow down or change direction. We can just do that anyway. And that's called risk management. Our problem in climate change is that no one really knows how near the climate cliff is. There are many of these so-called tipping points, but predicting when they'll tip is a science even less well advanced than predicting earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. So in the real world, the fog of the future never really clears. We do get better at forecasting, but we never, ever eliminate surprises. In fact, one of my favourite lines, my own line, I have to say, is that the greatest surprise of all would be a future with no surprises. So we're in control of the speed of this car, but doesn't prudence suggest that we should just hit the brakes hard? Well, but we don't. We're not sure how close the cliff edge is. It could be miles away. And right now, we're more worried about spilling the drinks in the cup holders if we were to brake too hard. So the challenge presented by both climate change and sustainability is that the policies that will have real traction will take decades and in some cases centuries to have a significant worldwide impact. The planet is just so big and the climate systems and most major ecosystems are just so vast, they exhibit a lot of natural inertia. But we, today's people, are being asked to make the behavioural changes and pick up the initial tab for making all this happen. Yet few of us are the ones really exposed to the future harms. It'll be our kids, our grandkids, and great-grandkids. But that's not how the psychology of risk-reward works. How much risk would you be willing to take for someone else's benefit? And particularly when that someone else is not yet born. You know, we expect our military to do this when we're at war. But me? Now? Why should I? It might never happen. Someone will have got a solution long before there's a real catastrophe, and so on. We are masters at thinking up reasons not to act. So that's why we continue driving at speed towards the cliff edge. It's either simple ignorance or an unshakable faith in the future emergence of a technological solution that'll either slow us down or send us speeding off in a new and safer direction. So maybe we'll all end up following Mr. Musk to Mars. That's how I kind of see sustainability, give you some sort of sense of my feeling about it.
That was so perfectly articulated. The whole sentences that you provided us. I had a couple of ideas from that. Is that are we too aware of what we have now, and we're not aware enough that we might not have it, or the next generation might not have it? I'm trying to visualize that. What am I like leaving on the table if I want to slow down the climate change and sustain the adaptation of the ecosystems?
Well, I think that there's a big questions in there that we can talk about. You know, how one should respond to climate change and to sustainability, and they all rest on assumptions that we might want to make about how the future is going to pan out. But I suspect that if you've got 10 people in a room and ask them that question, you get 20 different answers. So, and the problem is that, as I just mentioned, that the future is totally unknowable. I mean, you can't know what the future is going to be like. There are all sorts of things that we can predict with some confidence. You know, the Earth is going to continue spinning on its axis in much the same way over the next several thousand years as it has in the past several million, and it'll continue spinning around the sun. There are some things that we can be pretty confident about, but there is a huge amount that we have got no idea about. And you don't have to go far back in history. You know, literally in your own lifetime, and certainly, you know, in the last 100 years, 500 years, and ask yourself the question: what would people 250 years ago have dreamt up about what the world would be like in 2024? I had no idea. And why should we have any better idea now of what the future will be like in 2200? We can dream. There was I remember, can't remember the precise details, but I remember looking at one of these futurologists' deck of cards. They used to produce these in cigarette packs in some decades ago. And there was one guy that produced, there were very beautiful cards that you picked up when you got them in the cigarette packs. And the idea was to collect the set. And these were all futurology ones about how the world was going to be later in the 20th century. And going back over, I think there were 40 or so of these predictions. The few that became partly true were simply developments of things that were already going on. They were kind of marginal changes to what he was already aware of. But the things that he dreamt up, none of it happened. It was all, it was all just dreaming. We have no control, no idea. So when in your answer to the question about what should we leave on the table for the future, we should leave on the table what we feel we should leave on the table, and everybody's going to have a different answer to that question. I don't think there is an answer.
But we're certain that we're at the moment driving at some point over the cliff.
Yeah, but I don't think one wants to. I think that the driving over the cliff means that what we have now is not sustainable. But that doesn't mean it's the end of everything. We go over the cliff, we crash. I am not a doomster in the sense that I think that Homo sapiens is going to become extinct as a consequence of this event. People will pick themselves up, brush themselves off, and start all over again. That's what we've always done, and that's what people do. And all right, and maybe we will go back to 1 billion people, and they will then build something that will be sustainable. So that's why I'm trying to make the point. It's a question about what you value. So if you and you need to make a decision about what do you value, because that's where you should put your effort in sustainability. And
yeah.
As I say,
can I say something here? Sorry, I missed that, Robert. Sorry.
I said we all have different views about what it is that we value and what we want to leave on the table for future generations.
Yeah, we have different views.
I mean, I don't have children, Anthony, but my kids are now in their late 40s, and their lives and their aspirations are completely different from mine when I was their age. And if I was leaving on the table, what I thought then that they would need now, I would have got it wrong. Because the world moves on. We didn't have social media then. We didn't have, all sorts of stuff. The world just changes, and we change with it. And our expectations and our aspirations are always tailored to what is just out of reach, not what is completely unrealizable. So as things expand, opportunities expand, and as the opportunities contract, so our wants and needs also change. So there's no answer to the question. I don't think. I think it's a non-question.
Great. Is there something, Clive, that you wanted to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think yes, we don't know what it'll be like in 100 years as regards what human beings will produce, like how sophisticated AI will be, whether we'll all be sort of scooting around in cars that are sort of driving themselves. But there are things we can predict about sea level rise, because they just look at the historical record. They go back hundreds of thousands of years. They know what the temperature was. They know what the carbon dioxide was. They know what the sea level was. Lots of other things. And so the two things that spring to mind for me, one of them. I mean, I live in London, and I get on the tube quite often, and that's if that all gets flooded, that's billions, and the same for every coastal city around the world. The Paris Metro, New York, everywhere, Washington. All those underground transits are all useless, and all the cities have to move sort of further inland or something. That's a huge loss. To me, that would be. And this is why we like we don't like the idea of having to do cooling, of having to make clouds brighter to reflect away more sunshine to cool down the oceans, which are suddenly warming up even more. So they stop the pollution from shipping, so the oceans are suddenly heating up much faster. So sea level rise, that would be one of them. Some people we know are desperate to find ways to refreeze the Arctic, cool it down, let the ice grow back again. The other one for me would be food security. That you only need to have a heat wave for a couple of days or a day or for a short time. I'm not sure if it's a day or 2 days, and crops are ruined. You lose the whole harvest. If it's too hot, the whole crop is lost. And so I think we haven't quite reached that point yet. But the price of coffee, I see that the price of coffee is going up because there's too many crop failures. They're losing the crop. It's either too hot or too wet or something, or too humid. I don't know. And so this has been long predicted that there'll be problems with food, price of food going up, and in the UK, in the rich countries of Europe and America, will be able to afford it. The price will go up, but there'll be people who won't be able to afford it. And so, that's not fair on them. The fact that, you see, so those are the two things for me. If I had to pick anything, food security and sea level rise, cooling the oceans to prevent, because it's hard to imagine sea level rise suddenly going up again, because it was pretty much level, it's stable for 6,000 years. It's kind of in our not exactly DNA, but sort of cultural DNA. The fishing village 6,000 years ago became Tokyo today, or London or something. It's just a fishing village for thousands and thousands of years, 6,000 years. We know. And now, because temperatures are now rising, I think 10 times, this is what Jim Hansel said, 10 times faster than they ever have. I mean, in the whole of the world's history. I mean, okay, there was the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Obviously, the temperature rose very suddenly. So we don't mean that, but over a number of years, over sort of tens of years, the temperature is now rising 10 times faster than it ever had since the Earth first formed. Which was there wasn't even any oxygen in the atmosphere at that time. So to think that nothing's going to happen. Oh no, nothing's going to happen. It's not a problem. People are not sure. The level's going to stay the same. It's rising 10 times faster than it ever has. I mean, please get real. This is a serious problem.
It is,
we don't hear enough about it.
Yeah, I think the point you're making, Clive, I think is really well taken. And I think that the two examples you gave of food security and travel and sea level rise are interesting as to measure against each other. The sea level rise point is clearly a major threat, but it's a slow unfolding threat. Sea level is not going to suddenly rise by a metre or 2 metres. It's going to rise, and it may be a metre in the century, but it's not going to happen like over 5 years. But the food security point is that could happen like from 1 year to the next, because as temperatures rise, our food supply is still, even the meat eaters. The meat eaters depend upon animals that eat crops, and the crops can fail instantly with temperature rise and with marginal temperature rise. So it is perfectly feasible that over a very short period of a decade or even less, you could have major chunks of crop productivity just simply wiped out, and not sufficient time to adapt to the horticulture and agriculture to the changed conditions to create the new species that are more heat tolerant and so on and so forth, because all of that takes time. And cut a long story short, if there ain't enough food, two things happen. One is that the price goes up, and two is a lot of people go without food. And the people that go without food tend to die a lot sooner than the ones when they did have food. So this is the beginning of a major shift in the human population. Because, and you see it in other animal populations. When their food supply is threatened, the population shrinks naturally to match the available food. And humans are not exempt from these natural laws. So, that's where it's at. And I think the food issue, I think, is potentially a real wake-up call. And the tragedy, which we no doubt can talk about later, is that you can't resolve these problems overnight. We could say that you could have serious global food shortages within a decade. But actually, to avoid those food shortages probably would take much more than a decade. So we are really on a knife edge here, really, really on a knife edge.
What kind of actions or policies should we make?
Well, Clive and I are going to tell you that the whole decarbonisation policy that is now essentially baked into global climate change policy is inadequate. It's a combination of reducing emissions and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, neither of which is happening at any. In fact, emissions are still continuing to increase, and the actual quantity of greenhouse gases being removed from the atmosphere is almost it's insignificant in climate change terms. So that's just not happening. So the only other way of dealing with this is to reduce the amount of sunlight that's coming onto the Earth's surface and is warming it up. So what Clive and I are going to tell you is that if you really want to deal with this problem urgently, like it or not, you're going to have to deploy some of these technologies whose purpose is to reflect more sunlight back out to space and prevent it from falling on the Earth's surface. And we can talk about ways of doing that. But that's, in principle, the only other game in town. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Clive.
Yeah. People are afraid of those things. They come under the heading of SRM, solar radiation modification, or people say sunlight reflection methods. And the famous, or the one that people have been talking about for quite a long time, is sulfur in the stratosphere. But people have also been talking about clouds, marine clouds. So it's called marine cloud brightening. So that's low level, ordinary clouds, the clouds that you see in the sky. But the ones over the ocean reflect away. So if they're not there, then the sun goes into a dark. The ocean is dark, so it absorbs. The oceans are absorbing 91% of the additional energy that's now coming into the Earth through climate change, the greenhouse gases, for trapping heat. 91% of that energy goes into the ocean. So that means 9% in the land. So the land's not heating up as much as the ocean. The oceans are gradually heating up. That's what I'm catching up to do. When you ever have a cloud, white fluffy cloud over the ocean, it makes a big difference because it reflects sunshine. It just goes straight back out to space. So if a satellite or something out in space sees, instead of seeing something dark, which is the ocean, they see something light, which is a cloud. The light getting reflected back means it's a lot of energy, heat energy. Essentially, then heat energy gets reflected back. So clouds already, without clouds over the ocean or over the land, especially over the ocean, the whole Earth would have a completely different climate. And so learning about what forms clouds is fascinating. It's not easy. Basically, water vapor. We know about dew at night. It gets a little bit cold at night. Dust. The dew forms on the grass and surfaces because it's water vapor coming out of the air, and it has to condense somewhere. And that's what a cloud is essentially. It's where the air is cold and water. The air can't quite hold the water vapor, and so it condenses onto something. And there's always lots of tiny little aerosol particles in the air. And cloud physicists call cloud condensation nuclei, CCN, cloud condensation nuclei. So it can be just little bits of dust or sea salt. There's always some over the Atlantic pollen. So this is what we study and learn about mineral dust. And the ocean doesn't have anything like as many. So the clouds, you need to have lots and lots and lots of these aerosol particles to have lots and lots of tiny cloud droplets. That means you get a larger surface area. It means the cloud is brighter. So to make a cloud brighter, you actually have to have more droplets. And it turns out that shipping, until recently, there was legislation. Ships were allowed to simply just let their pollution go into the air, including sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide reacts in the air, becomes sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid very strongly attracts water, so it makes these droplets. So paradoxically, in the past, shipping was actually cooling. It was providing a very strong cooling surface, or making clouds over the ocean. And in the last few years, it's around about 2020, there's been different steps. The International Maritime Organization have passed legislation. No, you've got to reduce the amount of sulfur because it affects people's respiratory disorders if it blows near the coastline. So they've reduced the amount of sulfur, which has very markedly reduced it's called cloud albedo. The cloud reflectivity has reduced. It means this is why the oceans are suddenly warming up so much faster.
So, Clive, can I stop you there?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So what you're saying is because of the changes in the sulfur policy, it's actually backfiring because we're not getting enough reflection. And
that's right.
I have to add here that I've never heard this before, and I work in the logistics industry. I've worked in the logistics industry, and you have to pay like a 4% surcharge fee when like sending cargo on the boats, and it's highly regulated. And but it could actually be good. Please continue.
Well, people need to hear this. There's been a number of scientific papers published already that have measured the change, the cooling influence that was, when there was more pollution. And so what I've been working on with Franz, we understand pollution there's a good reason to remove pollution from the air. So we understand that, but it'd be great if we could get that cooling back with a much more benign aerosol. This is what we're working on: is what could be done to the ship's exhausts to modify them, and there's all kinds of chemistry that's very interesting. Basically, adding salt and iron oxide. We think we need to make it into a plasma that gets vaporized, and lots of very interesting chemistry happens. So you end up with particles of sodium sulfate, sodium nitrate, that make tiny particles that will make these clouds. And also, it turns out that this chemistry removes methane from the air as well. This has been a big surprise for me. That clouds, it's only been discovered in the last 2 or 3 years, that clouds have chemistry that remove methane. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, coming from mainly from wetlands, also from disused gas that's coming from all over the place. Agriculture, we hear about it coming from cattle, landfills, wastewater treatment. It's coming from all over the place. But it naturally gets removed by oxidation, very slow burn oxidation in the air. And it turns out it looks as though, there have been 2 or 3, maybe 4 scientific papers on the chemistry of methane removal happening quite naturally in clouds. And the smaller the droplets, the brighter the clouds, the stronger this methane removal chemistry works. And so this is very compelling for us. We want to get funding. We want, or either us or other groups, to start researching this to see how much faster is it happening in brighter clouds, and certain other things. There's other things that are known, like again, iron in mineral dust speeds up that process as well. We know that nitrates speed up the process. There's a lot of chemistry basically that ought to be researched in this area, because if shipping could quite cheap, quite low cost, they could have their exhaust gases modified to provide cloud reflectivity, cool the oceans, and remove methane. Would also help remove some of the smoke particles as well. Of course, smoke just blows over from all kinds of factories on the land as well. That's an oxidation process as well. This is what we want to kind of shout from the rooftop and tell people, please find some funding for this, because all these trillions on the energy transition that it's not going to provide any cooling. Not really. Not in the short term. Anyway, that's it.
I'll have to ask maybe a stupid question here. What's in it for the shipping companies? Do they have to pay? Because everybody's always talking about money. What's in it for them?
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if we've quite yet got methane removal credits. We know about carbon credits for removing carbon dioxide. Iron, though, very controversial. They're not ready to do it yet. It's long been known that large areas of the ocean are lacking in iron. Iron is needed by phytoplankton, the little algae that grow in the ocean. And when there's a little bit more iron, they grow better. They get more fish. They grow better. They draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. This is well known. So I don't think there's an answer right now. It's something that has to be put together. Methane removal credits, maybe carbon credits. We think carbon credits. I mean, there's a lot going on in that sort of space as well. Whether there can ever be such a thing as cooling credits to actually measure the amount of cloud reflectivity that's changed. It's not easy to do. They have to do it with satellite records and use statistical analysis to see, has it changed compared to what it usually is, But I think all these things are possible with modern technology. There's lots of clever people about. All kinds of talented people, I think, are needed to put these sort of solutions together. We think we have the beginnings of a solution, yeah.
And we're foolish if we don't investigate them.
Yeah. Well, I think your question, Anthony, is a very interesting one because it highlights what to me is the major reason that none of this is happening. Because for me, the question of what's in it for the shipping companies is about the stupidest question that could be asked. And I say that because what it does, the effect of the question is to frame climate change essentially as an economic issue. And climate change is not an economic issue. I mean, it has a cost associated with it, obviously, but it is fundamentally an existential issue. It is not an economic issue. And if all of your responses to climate change are mediated through market mechanisms, then I think it will be. My personal view, and it obviously is a personal view, is that would virtually guarantee climate catastrophe, because that isn't what markets. That's not the purpose of markets. Markets are not there to address these sorts of issues where essentially we've got a dysfunction in the global commons, in the atmosphere, in the ocean, and so on. The market's there to make profits for businesses, and I'm not knocking that. I mean, that's not a problem. We've all benefited from that. But addressing climate change is not fundamentally the responsibility of the market. So the challenge really needs to be turned on its head. And what has to happen is that the powers that be, and we can have a conversation about who the powers that be might be, but they have got to pick up the responsibility for finding these various solutions, some of which will be technological solutions, some of which will just be behavioural change solutions. It doesn't all have to cost money. And then when they found the solutions that are climatically effective, that's step one. Step two is to ask the question you just asked. Okay, now we know what we've got to do. How can we do this in the most market-friendly way to make it happen? Not the most market-friendly way to not make it happen because the market doesn't like it. So that is a second piece of engineering, but you've got to start with the criterion of what's the most climatically effective response, and then come to the economics secondarily. And we don't do that. That is not how we do it. And that to me is one of the reasons why I am frankly so despairing, because until we make that shift, we're going to constantly be asking the wrong question. And if you constantly ask the wrong question, you're constantly going to get the wrong answer.
Absolutely right. I think greed is one of the biggest flaws that we have, but it also helps us with adaptation. This is one of the angles that I see constantly. Is in the discussions around sustainability and climate change is always like, what's in it for me? Like, do I have to give up something? Is my business going to be unsustainable? And so
No, we do this routinely. There's nothing radical about this. The whole notion of a civilized society is that constraints are put on a range of activities. We no longer have people throwing their shit into the street, which they used to do some hundreds of years ago. That's prohibited. You're not allowed to do that. Because there are regulations that stop you from doing it. And there are regulations over any number of activities, both in our private lives. We're not allowed to drive faster than whatever the speed limit is, and companies, businesses, every single part of the economy have regulations, the purpose of which is to make their activities less damaging for the communities in which they live, the people, for the animals, or whoever it may be. We have these regulations all the time, and they impose costs on the businesses, and the businesses pass those costs on to the consumers. That's fine. But if we want to live in a civilized society that has a clean atmosphere, and where everybody's able to thrive, and the animals are thriving, and we're all happy, and we've got freedom to do what we want to do, then that's the price of the ticket. So the question is not what's it going to cost the businesses. Actually, it's going to be what's it going to cost us, because we're the ones that are going to be paying for it. And we've got to encourage our politicians to impose those regulations and those costs, to internalize those costs, which has historically not been done, to ensure that people behave properly. There's nothing new about the principle. We're just not doing it now. And
the problem is that they do it in this country, Robert. They do it in this country, and then they don't do it in other countries. Well, then we lose competitive advantage. So it needs to be across the board. Yeah.
It's done patchily all over the place. Everywhere does it a bit, and everywhere doesn't do it. Excuse me. And obviously, the thing about climate change is that it's a global issue. It's not like polluting a local river, which is very much a local community thing or maybe a national thing. But climate change it's global. So the world has to act together as a unit. And that, again, is a novel dimension. There's never been a problem in human history where the entire human race or human species has had to act in unison to address a common problem. We haven't developed the skill set to do that. We're doing it now, and we're not doing it very effectively.
But I think that it was a great start that we got the Paris Agreement signed. So that's something that depended on, non-dependent on like religion and so on. So
I couldn't disagree with you more. The Paris Agreement was an abject failure. It was a failure because it arose because of the failure of Copenhagen to reach a formal, legally binding agreement. So all that Copenhagen did was abandon the requirement for governments around the world to be legally bound by the commitments and to come up with this wishy-washy national commitments that they can talk about and play with and fiddle around and do nothing. So yes, they came to an agreement, but it's an ineffective agreement. So yeah, the world has acted together. We've all held hands and we've said, let's do this. Well, let's do it is a very different thing from doing it. So to me and to many others, indeed commentators at the time, regarded Copenhagen as being a disaster, but dressed up very, very, very well as a success. And this is what the spin doctors do.
Do you mean Paris?
Sorry, Paris. Sorry, I mean Paris. I'm talking about Paris. Sorry, yeah, I misspoke. Yes, that Paris was dressed up. It was a disaster that was dressed up as a great success. And we are living that because since Paris, what has happened to emissions? They've continued to go up. Big surprise. Okay, that's the level of international commitment that we see. And you have to ask yourself, why should that change in the future?
They need strong treaties, but they weren't willing to. Governments are not willing to really sign up for something that would really work. So they just say, "Oh, we'll just have good intentions."
They won't do it because unfortunately, they are beginning to realise the actual implications of an effective climate response policy. And it would be tough if you really want to avert, to have a high degree of confidence that you could avert a climate catastrophe, to avert kakorki, as I call it, then the policies you'd have to adopt would be really quite radical. They'd be quite intrusive. They, in many respects, would be very unpalatable. And politicians would have a tough time getting their people to agree to them. So I don't underestimate the difficulty, and the difficulty grows by the year, because the more we don't act, the tougher the act is. And that, again, one of the reasons why I'm quite despondent and don't think that we will resolve this, because I think that the problem has grown to a point now where it's actually politically unsolvable. Nobody has got the power to actually deal with the problem. And the only power big enough to deal with the problem, you know what it is? It's nature itself. Nature will sort the problem. And nature doesn't have any sentimental views about it. It's tough.
Nature doesn't care about our policies, our politics, our sentiments, our intentions, nothing.
Yeah, I remember who was the person who said so, that nature will always exist, or longer than humans will. Can't remember his name.
So I missed what somebody said that.
He said that nature and Earth will exist longer than humans will.
Well, we forget, Anthony, that we are part of nature. We're not, it's not humanity and nature. We are part of it. And we're subject to the same laws, the same rules, the same pressures. We have to feed, we have to drink. We have, and if there are too many of us and we overgrow our resources, we have to either grow the resources or we have to shrink our needs. There's nothing magical about this. It's the same for every living species.
Yes, absolutely. So I just wanted to go ask back, do you still want to talk about SRM, or do you want to move on into nuclear energy?
Did you want to say any more about SRM, Robert?
I think there are some things that are worth talking about SRM. I think that there are some objections to SRM that are very vociferously and aggressively pursued by a number of NGOs and other civil society organisations. I don't know whether you probably didn't see, but there was a session at the New York Climate Week on Tuesday, I think it was, specifically on this subject. And I think that the objections that they raised to solar radiation management are very powerfully expressed and very seriously misguided. And I think it might be worthwhile now just talking a little bit about, it's not a sustainability question, but it is about, why I think that SRM in any of its forms is going to struggle to get off the ground. Not because technically or climatically it doesn't make sense, but because politically it's got a huge problem. And I think it's worthwhile just talking about that. So the main, so I'll just go through this. The main objections to solar radiation management in its various forms, and it's worthwhile stressing here that the one technology that is most frequently talked about is called stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI for short. And what this involves is, briefly, sending aeroplanes up into the lower stratosphere, about 50,000 feet up, and spraying an aerosol of sulfuric acid into the atmosphere. And it does what Clive was explaining before. It forms little aerosol particles, and these have the effect of reflecting back sunlight. Okay. There's a lot of studies being done on this, academic studies. These are modelling and laboratory studies. So there's a high degree of knowledge about how it might work. but there has never been any effective research in the ambient environment. Nobody's actually done it at any kind of scale. But that's the one that is most frequently talked about. And just historically, to put it in context, when in 1965, President Johnson commissioned a report on climate issues, because it was even then becoming a topic of interest, stratospheric aerosol injection was the only response to climate change that was proposed in the report. So again, there's nothing new about this. It's been around a long time, and that's one of the reasons why it's most talked about. So this is the one that people mostly react to. So the objections to it are the following. There's what's called a moral hazard argument, which is basically that if you do this, it will deter the process of decarbonisation and reducing emissions. There's an argument about equity that it will be organised by the global north, and they won't really give too much concern for the impact on the global south. There's an issue about something called termination shock, so that if you use this cooling method for an extended period of time, so that you kind of lock in a certain amount of cooling by doing this, and then you suddenly stop doing it, the cooling that you'd created in the past would effectively be reversed in a period of 10 or 20 years. And if you were talking about 2 or 3 degrees of cooling, and you had 2 or 3 degrees of warming in 20 years, it would be a catastrophic ecosystem shock for most plant life. And this would be a kind of a major catastrophe. So these are the main objections. And there's something else I'll come on to as well. So let me just talk about this. So first of all, the equity issue, in my view, is no more than of academic interest. The climate system is global. It's almost impossible to protect certain geographical regions in isolation from the rest of the globe. It's also worth noting that the regions that are likely to suffer most would be the same ones that would suffer most with no or inadequate intervention from reducing emissions. So geoengineering is very unlikely to make their situation much worse than it would have otherwise have been. So I think that it's a kind of this idea that somehow these global interventions will disfavour or disadvantage the global south more than the global north. I think it's just based on a misunderstanding of the way the climate system works, because it all gets mixed up really, really quickly. In the context of geoengineering, the moral hazard thing is I find it's something that really kind of annoys me. Moral hazard comes out of it's a term that was used in the insurance sector for hundreds of years, and it doesn't have a value judgment. It's just a feature about the way that people behave, and it's essentially saying that people that are protected from a risk are more likely to behave more riskily in respect of that risk. So, for example, if you've got house insurance, you're more likely to leave the house and forget to close a window than if you haven't got insurance and you think, oh yeah, if a burglar gets in, I'm going to lose money, so I'll make sure that I close the windows, and you're a little bit more risk averse because you haven't got the protection. So the term moral hazard came up primarily or recently in the context of the financial crash in 2008, and it was applied to all these nasty bankers who were lining their pockets by doing all these crazy deals on the basis that the banks were too big to fail and the governments would bail them out, which largely is exactly what happened. So this gave the term a kind of a pejorative sense, which has continued into the notion of geoengineering. You've got all these fossil fuel companies, all these nasty fossil fuel companies that are going to use geoengineering as an excuse not to reduce the production of fossil fuel. This is nonsense. First of all, there's no evidence that over the last 20, 30 years, when emissions have not gone down, that any kind of geoengineering or SAI in particular has had any bearing on this to encourage the fossil fuel companies not to reduce their emissions. It simply hasn't been on the agenda. Nobody's talked about it. It's just not there. So, the fossil fuel companies didn't need any encouragement to maintain or increase their production. They just do it because it's profitable. And what research has been done has been quite inconclusive, because you're really asking people about their attitudes to something that they've never experienced. So, it's all a bit kind of imaginary. And in fact, there's been more than one research effort that has demonstrated that when people have learned about how scary geoengineering might be, it's actually galvanized them into redoubling their efforts to decarbonize. So it's had exactly the reverse effect. Rather than saying, oh, well, we've got this, so we don't have to worry about decarbonizing, they're saying, oh my God, if we're going to do that, we better decarbonize. So they don't do it. So the moral hazard argument is simply, there's no evidence for it. And the final point about this is that actually, even if it did emerge as a problem, it could be solved literally at the stroke of a pen. Because all that would need to happen is that governments would have to turn around and would have to implement a regulation that prevented the fossil fuel companies from doing whatever it was that they were doing that was causing the production to increase. So they would say, no, you can't do it. We're going to put a cap on production, so you can't increase it. Yeah, easily done. So moral hazard is always talked about, and it's a complete non-argument. And it stresses me that it's still being talked about. So the next one is this thing about the issue. Excuse me, let me have another drink here. I'm losing my voice. The issue of termination shock. So I explained what termination shock is. And the great thing about termination shock is that it demonstrates the concept of termination shock demonstrates how important it is to maintain your removal of emissions and removal of greenhouse gases. Because it is true that if you had that situation where you used SRM to save or to create 2 degrees of cooling and you suddenly stopped, you would have this problem. So what we learn from that is either don't stop or don't allow all of the cooling to be done solely by SAI. When you're doing that, at the same time, keep the pressure up on reducing emissions. So the termination shock argument really does one thing very powerfully. It stresses that SAI and SRM generally is a complement to and not an alternative to emissions reduction and decarbonisation. And that's a very, very critical point that people forget when they're talking about termination shock. And it demonstrates the wrong-headedness of the whole moral hazard argument. And second, we have to ask whether the likelihood of the harms from an abrupt cessation of SRM would be any more severe than the likelihood and harms from a continuing failure to reduce atmospheric GHGs. So, we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place here. We don't know which actually would be worse. And that's one of the problems. So we boxed ourselves into a corner, and there's really no way out that doesn't entail some risk. And I'm not saying there isn't a risk from termination shock. I'm simply saying that it's a risk that we've got to acknowledge or we've got to find a way of dealing with. So those wanting to eliminate the risk will end up by doing nothing. And in so doing, they'll guarantee the long-term policy failure. We have to remember that even reducing emissions at speed is fraught with risk. And those that don't recognise this are as guilty of denial as those who for years claimed that there was no such thing as man-made global warming. So finally, I just want to make one last point about this arguments against SRM. When considering whether geoengineering is dangerous, and I apply this to all of these technologies, including indeed carbon dioxide removal and others, I would say that anything done in a cavalier manner is likely to be dangerous. You don't do the research, you don't do it properly, you're obviously going to make it dangerous. But humanity has for thousands of years been innovating and building technologies, new technologies at scale, and many of them are inherently dangerous. Crossing the oceans, which ships can sink with the loss of all on board, flying high above the earth, risking everyone's death if the engines fail. Piping explosive gas to burn in people's homes to keep them warm, and bringing electricity to almost every corner of the planet where it could electrocute people or cause fires. I mean, the list is endless. We do this routinely, but we built this infrastructure carefully, prudently, diligently, intelligently, and there's absolutely no reason to suppose that geoengineering would not be done in the same sensible manner. So I think that these objections are they're understandable, but they're not thought through. And unfortunately, at the moment, the other side of the argument is not being sufficiently eloquently and widely put. Hopefully, through your podcast and your blog, we might be able to get that message across to a wider audience.
I hope so too. We can all hear the passion, the studies, and the effort that you made regarding the studies.
Yeah, it's very well said, Robert. I thought what you just said there.
It's something that I have to listen to like 5 times to really get it. And I think all the viewers are the same. So we need more information about it to make it more, simplistic, or to be like a natural talking point, a natural discussion to have with your friend.
Yeah, that'd be great. We've discussed this endlessly in our own meetings and groups, but we know that we need to be talking on podcasts like this. So.
But I think we need more examples, like with the car and the fog, to understand complex problems, because everything that we're talking about, sustainability and the climate change, we're talking in such words that I say the word common people, normal people that are not involved with energy or these kind of matters, they don't know what we're really talking about. They just understand what they hear, and it's only like one truth. So I love really the examples that have been given out.
But it is a problem, because the objections that they raise, I understand it. It comes from a good place, but it's a fundamental misunderstanding. And the problem is that climate change is not seen as a risk management issue by these people. In fact, the people that are putting these arguments forward, when you look at their background, they're mostly social scientists of various different types. Lots of people that are concerned about equity issues and north-south inequalities and these sorts of factors. And they've got perfectly legitimate concerns. I mean, I'm not trying to ridicule the arguments they're making, but they're just looking at one side of the coin. They're not looking at it as a risk issue. And there's an assumption in their positions which they are not sufficiently well examining. And the assumption is that solar radiation management, and I'm not pursuing any particular type or any particular way of doing it, but the idea of increasing the Earth's reflectivity, their position assumes that it's not necessary, that we can avert the serious risk of major ecosystem and widespread societal collapse without it. Now, they may be right, but we don't know. And it looks increasingly unlikely. So ultimately, it comes down to a simple question: how much risk are you going to take with, given the scale of the problem? And as you probably know, that the risk is an interesting word, because actually risk mathematically has a very precise meaning. And that meaning is the likelihood, the probability of an event occurring, multiplied by the cost of the damage it causes if it does. Okay? So it's the product of probability and harm. So it follows that if you've got something that is very unlikely but is going to kill you, okay, you might be more worried about that than something that's very likely to happen, okay, and is going to break your fingernail. So it is an appreciation of the nature of risk is also something that is missing in this. The stakes here are very high. The stakes are very high. And I think we need to take a very risk-averse position. And a risk-averse position means that it would be perilous to assume, given where we've got to, and the history is very important here, but given where we've got to, it would be perilous to assume that decarbonisation only policy is now going to be effective.
This has been so awesome, and I've learned so much. And like I said before, I need to watch and listen to the show like 5 or 10 times to really understand it. I hope that I can get more information about SRM and the things that we've discussed today. So I'll put them on the notes. But are there any final comments? What message would you like to leave the listeners with? Is it an optimistic one or a pessimistic one? What can one do going on forward from here?
Shall I take that?
Yeah.
Well, my message here is in two parts. What I think we should do now and what I think we will do now. And sadly, they're very different. So what we should do now is to get out the message that decarbonisation alone, and that's reducing emissions and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, is now looking like a very high-risk strategy. If we want to keep surface temperature in check to prevent widespread ecosystem and societal collapse, we need to start preparing to cool the planet by reducing, very slightly, the amount of sunlight reaching Earth's surface. This is not without risk, and to manage those risks, we need to start now investing in some serious research, not just in computer models and laboratories, but also in the outside real world, with a view to starting to build SRM to scale during the 2030s. At the same time, we need to investigate ways in which the demand for energy can be significantly reduced. That almost certainly means lifestyle changes that many of us might find hard to accept. So long as we are wedded to the notion of continual economic growth and forever increasing consumption, we make our species' survival less and less sustainable. Novel products and efficiencies will not square this circle. In fact, they're more likely to fuel even faster growth and even greater unsustainability. So as to what I think we will do, sadly, I think the forces of reaction and conservation will hold their grip on policy and move too slowly, and our house of cards will collapse. Starting in a decade or two, I see a slow-motion car crash destroying much of what we've created and reducing the human population back to its pre-industrial level long before surface temperature gets there. But after several decades of misery, there'll be a renewal, a regeneration, and the prospect of a whole new era. So look upon the collapse as a sort of catharsis, a clearing out, the removal of the dead wood. So in the short term, yeah, all right, I'm a pessimist. But in the longer term, I'm an optimist. It's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. I hope that gives all of you out there some crumbs of comfort to what I think are going to be a tough few years ahead.
Anything you want to add there, Clive?
It's all too much, really. Robert he thinks very rigorously about his answers, and I could only give a variation on a similar sort of theme. We don't know. I think he and I hope he's wrong.
Absolutely.
I think we hope that's wrong. That we hope that something like, for me, marine cloud brightening. Given that ships were already doing it, nobody complained when they were cooling the oceans. Nobody even knew it was happening. That should be brought back and brought back in a much more benign way and much more deliberate way. So that's what should be done. Whether it will be done, as Robert said, that's where the money should be going, in proper research into that. Whether they'll do it or not, or whether they'll just keep spending their trillions on, rare earths for wind turbines that then don't blow in the wind, and even if because the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is already too much. Even if they stop putting more CO2, which they're not going to stop anyway, even if they could stop, Jim Hansen says it's still going to keep going up. The oceans are going to keep warming up anyway. They've still got a lot of catching up to do. So it's got to be cooling. It's got to happen. And to me, cloud cooling is the safest. That's the one I forgot. But I'll leave my answer at that. And say thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much for letting us listen to this passionate and informative message. That's all.